Welcome to Businesstalk podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. We are delighted to have Dr. Pierre Dussauge, Professor of Strategy and Business Policy at HEC Paris, joins us as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Pierre holds an MSc from HEC Paris and earned his PhD in Management Science from Paris UFAN University. He served as a visiting professor of corporate strategy and international business at the University of Michigan's Rhodes School of Business from 1991 to 2003 and has held teaching positions at leading institutions worldwide, including INSEAD, IAC, India Business School, and Indian School of Business India and Tsinghua University, China. He is the author or co-author of several influential books in strategic management, including Strategic Technology Management, Les Stratégies Alliances, 1985 Mackenzie Award winner for Best Management Book in France, Cooperative Strategy, and Strategy. His research has been published in leading academic journals, including journals such as Strategic Management Journal, Journal of International Business Studies, and MIT Sloan Management Review. In recent years, his work has focused on global strategic alliance. Beyond academia, Dr. Pierre has served as a consultant and management educator for numerous companies across Europe and the US, including Mars, Fiat, Schneider, American Airlines, DuPont, IBM, Apex, Suez, Unilever, Orange, Air France, KLM, and Publicis, and others. In this episode, Dr. Pierre Dussauge shares insights from his acclaimed book, Cooperative Strategy, Competing Successfully Through Strategic Alliances. It is my pleasure to now welcome Professor Dr. Pierre to the conversation. Dr. Dussauge, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Professor, your book emphasizes anticipating the evolution and outcomes of alliances before they are formed. Can you walk us through the key framework that managers can use to forecast alliance success or failure?
So I guess the main idea we develop in the book is that assuming that alliances are necessarily going to be win-win because both firms participating, or even if it's more than two firms participating in the alliance, see the benefits they can get out of it. We argue in the book that it's important to anticipate outcomes that may not be the immediate objectives being pursued by the partner firms, but that may have a long-lasting effect on the financials, the competitive position, the technological position of the different companies. So to simplify it as best I can, I think we identified two very broad categories of alliances. Alliances that are based on complementarity between the partners, which means that one firm needs something that the other firm is contributing, and obviously the other firm should need something as well, otherwise the alliance won't be formed. And I think in those alliances, what we've observed is that the way in which the mutual dependence evolves over time is a very important factor in the outcome of the alliance. So if one firm forms an alliance with a partner who over the years manages, or even over a few months, manages to compensate for the deficiency they had, and which was the reason why they formed the alliance in the first place, that partner is going to be left high and dry and in a very vulnerable position. So that would be one category. The other category is that we observe quite a few alliances that are formed to benefit from greater scale, to sort of have the benefits that they would have if they were a much bigger company, but by pooling either production or pooling purchases or pooling a certain number of activities. And what we observe in this case is very different than in the case of complementary alliances. The major problem is the inefficiencies that are underestimated at the beginning and that creep up and become quite significant over time. For example, even if two companies agree on forming a joint venture to produce a raw material or an upstream component that they both need, over time, one partner is probably going to see what they need change, and there are going to be discrepancies in the new way of producing or even the definition of the input that they're trying to build scale on. And that leads to all sorts of inefficiencies that probably more than compensate for the benefit that the alliance was creating at the beginning. I can think of an example, which is two French automakers, Peugeot and Renault, used to have a plant that was supposed to make automobile components and in particular engines. And over the years, each of the two partners, Renault and Peugeot, wanted different kinds of engines. And after a few years, this plant actually was one plant, but was really two operations, producing two different engines for both partners, and therefore created more management problems than they benefited in terms of economies of scale. So I would argue that the first thing to identify is what sort of broad type of alliance we're talking about. Is it essentially to build on complementarity, in which case some problems are going to creep up, or is it to create economies of scale, in which case it's a very different kind of dynamic that is likely to create problems in the longer run? And that would be the very broad framework that we try to develop in the book that you're so kind to mention at this point.
Thank you. Professor, many alliances involve companies that are also competitors. What are the most common challenges of co-opetition, and how can firms navigate the tension between cooperation and rivalry effectively?
So let me actually make it even worse. I think at the beginning, when alliances are not between competitors, the issue of rivalry doesn't come into the discussion. But if there is room for a strategic alliance between two firms, it is very likely that they will turn into competitors. We can think of companies operating in one country and a foreign company licensing products or relying on a local partner for local market penetration. And I guess what we've observed is that sooner or later, the local partner may want to be in the same business on their own, or the foreign partner will eventually want to operate like a domestic firm. And without even realizing, these two companies that thought of themselves as non-competing end up, in fact, as rivals. And I think that anticipating the likelihood of rivalry in alliances is a very important sort of precautionary measure to take. Now, I think the way in which these questions can be dealt with is actually by creating in the initial agreement exclusivity zones, which is to say certain things are beyond limits, and therefore it's a way to limit as much as possible the competition that may creep up in alliances. I can think of an alliance between a company that's very big in dairy products called Danone. And Danone had a joint venture with a Chinese company, and everything seemed to be working fine until they realized that the Chinese company was starting to export to markets where Danone was already operating. And at that point, it created all sorts of difficulties. They had to renegotiate the agreement. And I think even though at the beginning it was difficult to even consider the possibility of rivalry, I think eventually these kinds of things end up creeping up in these alliances. I can think of another example, which is Colgate had a joint venture with a company from Hong Kong, and they had created a sort of a local brand of toothpaste. Uh, it's now called Darlie. Uh, I don't know if it's still sold in China and in a number of markets. And Unilever decided that to go abroad in Southeast Asia, this brand would work better than some of the other brands they had. And they basically took it, and the local partner was not very happy with this kind of situation. So I think the possibility for, and I'm not even arguing that there was any wrongdoing or that there was any intention to hurt or to be aggressive with the partner. It's just the natural evolution of the business within around the alliance tends to lead to rivalry. And I think the way to do it is to have in the agreement limitations on, for example, exports, on adjacent products. Is it okay or not okay to launch adjacent products that may not directly be within the alliance, but could sort of create unwanted competition between the partners?
Professor, in the book you mentioned that managers often overestimate the benefit of alliances and underestimate the pitfalls. What are some of the most frequent miscalculations you have observed in strategic alliances?
I think it's where we started our conversation. Um, I think sort of the most commonly used expression when when managers start talking about alliances is this idea of win-win. We tend to see the benefits we can get from it. The partner hopefully sees benefits as well, but I think it's a psychological twist. There's over enthusiasm in in the alliance, and I don't think that bringing in lawyers is going to fix that, because the problem is not so much the legality of the contract. It's actually in anticipating the kinds of evolutions. So it takes a long-term view. It takes sort of imagining what sort of the alliance will lead to and how eventually this might create, uh, for example, more competition that will end up being very detrimental or will actually carve out a market that the company was counting on in the future and these kinds of situations. So I think it's really anticipation is the best way to prevent these miscalculations and sort of I'm not arguing that alliances should be developed in an unfriendly atmosphere, but I think over enthusiasm is never a very good guide because when the problems do come up, not only are the problems in and of themselves an issue, but it creates a lot of disappointment, mistrust, the feeling that we've been cheated, even though I don't think it's a matter of cheating or not cheating. It's a matter of the evolution of the deal.
Your book cites examples from companies like Boeing, Intel, and Nestle. How do the dynamics of alliances differ across industries, particularly in high tech versus consumer goods?
I think alliances are likely to deal with some of the critical factors in what key factors for success. And depending on the industry, these key factors for success may be very different. So I can think in consumer goods, there can be agreements that have to do with distribution, with branding. And I think it would be natural for companies to focus on that. It could also be sort of figuring out consumer products that are at the intersection between two different businesses. I'm thinking of Pepsi and Unilever, I think, have an agreement to create this sort of soft tea-based soft drink, whatever it's called. I can't remember now. And why? Because in consumer goods, coming out with innovative products, with appealing innovations is the main issue. In high tech, I think the development of technology, the establishment of standards may have a much bigger weight in the success or failure of an endeavor. And so the alliances will reflect that and mainly be formed. What we really call strategic alliances will be formed around these critical factors. So in
Professor,
that
yeah.
sense, it changes from one industry to another.
Professor, alliances can take years to show results. How can managers balance short-term performance pressure with the long-term nature of many strategic partnerships?
Actually, I think that's one of the critical issues in alliances. And it's not unlike mergers and acquisitions, but it may even be worse. It's very difficult to tell, even in hindsight, if a merger or an acquisition has been a success or not really a success, because so many other things have happened during the years that it's very difficult to isolate the effect of a particular, for example, acquisition, or in our case, of a particular alliance. What makes it worse is that alliances, in most cases, there are exceptions, but in most cases, don't really have a P&L. When two companies decide to form an alliance to develop technology, the technology doesn't generate a profit. What generates a profit is the use of the technology within a particular business, within one firm or the other or both. And it's very difficult to figure out how much the alliance has contributed to the profit. I think the only kind of alliances in which a profit can be easily identified are self-contained joint ventures, where the joint venture is endowed with assets or resources or technology from the partners, but then operates as a standalone operation. But most alliances don't work like that. Most alliances entail the exchange of technology, in some cases, even the sale of inputs into a process. And so it's very difficult to, I even feel like saying, looking at the profit that accrues at the level of the alliance is almost always a mistake, because a lot of the benefits accrue around the alliance, not really within the alliance. I read up on a company called Hindustan Lever that used to be a very large joint venture between Unilever and an Indian corporation. And at least what I had read is that Unilever was deriving more profits from the sale of technology, from the licensing of technology, than it was as a shareholder in the joint venture that had been formed. What does it mean? It means that if you only look at the profits at the joint venture level, you're missing out on a lot of what's going on. And maybe I wonder if it wasn't the Barty Group at the time, I'm not sure, but probably was getting technology out of this joint venture, or was getting investments that they wouldn't have made on their own, that to some extent they may have been able to use for other things. So it's very difficult to boil down the financial results of an alliance to what is really visible. And I think managers should be very well aware of that. and should be careful not to focus too much on the profits that accrue at the joint venture level or at the alliance level.
Beyond financial gains, what metrics or indicators should companies monitor to evaluate the true success of an alliance over time?
So I think that's where it comes back to our very first point, which is we need to know exactly why we're creating the alliance. What do we want to get out of it in the long term? And we need to monitor that this is actually happening. And so I think firms should set up particular KPIs on the important factors that they are trying to get out of the alliance. Um, a very, very famous alliance that was formed between General Motors and Toyota was the famous NUMMI joint venture that was created to produce cars that would be sold under the two brands in the US. And at least the story about this goes that what General Motors wanted to learn about was the sort of, at the time, the quality management processes that Toyota had in place. And they thought that by managing a joint venture together with Toyota, they would be able to acquire that knowledge. Toyota, on the other hand, wanted to figure out how to deal with US unions, labor unions, with local authorities, and doing it with General Motors was a way to get the sort of some of that knowledge. And I think the mistake that General Motors made is that they didn't really track the progress that they were making in terms of transferring what they were learning in the joint plant into General Motors managed plants. Another issue is, again, this is anecdotal, but is that the way in which they were hoping to learn was they would send busloads of General Motors managers to visit the plant and then go back to their job, when I think the knowledge that was important to them required much more time, investment, actually required working at the plant rather than just visiting the plant. In hindsight, they could have visited Toyota plants in Japan. It would have been faster and cheaper, but would not have produced results either. But as there were relatively few General Motors plants managers in the joint plant, there wasn't very much. It was very difficult to retransfer to all the plants that General Motors had in the US at the time. So I think it requires very specific KPIs, but to be able to set those KPIs up, each partner has to know exactly what they're trying to get out of the alliance and joint venture, above and beyond any financial profits that probably are part of the deal, but need to be put into perspective. There are much bigger issues at stake.
Professor, in today's increasingly globalized market, how do cross-border alliances differ from domestic one? And what additional considerations should managers keep in mind?
So I think local alliances, domestic alliances, actually are not as common, uh, which is a bit of a paradox. Business tends to be domestic before it goes global. But when we're dealing with alliances, even from just a regulation point of view, it creates antitrust concerns within the potential partner firms. I think the perception of rivalry is much stronger. Whereas when dealing with a company that is based halfway around the world, I think it seems far away. It doesn't raise as many concerns. On the other hand, I think one of the difficulties in global alliances is cultural differences, legal differences from one environment to another. So there can be lots of misunderstandings or more misunderstandings than in domestic alliances. But at the same time, and it may backfire in the long run, but I think the concern about rivalry is not quite as strong in many cases between the partner firms in international alliances, because each partner views their home market as their main priority. Foreign markets are seen as optional to some extent, and alliances seem to be a practical, quick, and maybe even cheap way to expand market reach for companies. So, strangely enough, I think companies are more paranoid about competition in the context of domestic alliances than in the context of international alliances, global alliances.
Professor, alliances inherently involve uncertainty. How can managers make robust decisions in situations where the potential benefit and risk are difficult to quantify?
Um, I feel like saying there is no guarantee. Life is uncertain. Uh, and I guess management is uncertain. Strategy does not unfold in a stable context. And I think alliances is just a reflection of that. But I think one of the issues or one of the factors that managers should pay a lot of attention to is the evolution of the alliance over time, is to realize that the starting point is not going to be the context that will remain the whole duration of the alliance, that it's impossible to anticipate where things will go, but at least I think it's worth laying out those directions that the firm does not want the alliance to go into. And this again may involve exclusivity clauses in the deal. And these exclusivity clauses can have to do with types of products, with types of markets. So there are certain markets that are considered to be off limits to the alliance operation. And I think the best way to overcome the problems of uncertainty is to be as clear as possible on the directions in which we definitely don't want the partnership to go. I think methods like pre-mortem are a good way to sort of think about this. If this were to end up in a catastrophe, what would it take to get there? And then try to put some roadblocks in that direction to avoid an evolution that is totally unwanted.
Professor, my last question. With the rise of digital platforms, AI, and rapid technological change, how do you see the role of alliances evolving over the next decade?
Um, Actually, I think the interesting thing is that because digital technologies reach out in all directions, but have some very big players who are trying to go in those directions without necessarily knowing what is really sort of profitable in the long term or not. I think of a company like Google, Alphabet. Uh, so reaching out into health, reaching out into self-driving automobiles, reaching out into all sorts of directions, just because I guess I was going to say their control, or at least their ability to utilize data in sort of ways that most other firms cannot, opens many doors, provided the new areas in which they want to get into can be opened by firms that know the business. And Google has created, if I'm not mistaken, an alliance with a pharmaceutical company to try to use big data to better treat diabetes in patients. And they need it would be very difficult for them to develop pharmaceutical products on their own. So they need alliances. And I think the established firms in a wide variety of industries realize that sort of trying to rely on the kind of data that Google can manipulate becomes a very big advantage. And so I think we're going to see lots of alliances like this. And I think these alliances will raise exactly the problems that we've been talking about for the past 30 or so minutes, because actually who will end up controlling the sector of diabetes medicine? Will it be Google, who will use pharmaceutical companies almost as subcontractors, or is it or will it be the pharmaceutical giants that will sort of farm out some of the data processing and data collection to the likes of Google or others? And I think alliances are not going to go away. Quite the opposite.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pierre Dussauge, for sharing your invaluable insights on strategic alliances and cooperative strategy. Your framework and real-world examples have not only shed lights on the complexities of collaboration in business, but have also provided actionable guidance for managers seeking to navigate these often challenging partnerships. To our listeners, we hope this conversation inspires you to think differently about alliances, not just as a tool for growth, but as a strategic endeavor that requires foresight, planning, and careful execution. Thank you once again, Dr. Pierre Dussauge, for joining with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.